Take a look at this illustration. What do you think this meeting is about? You might have noticed this huge map of Africa, or these men pointing to it. We can infer that this meeting is about Africa. In fact, this illustration depicts an international conference that took place in 1884, not on the African continent, but in Berlin, Germany. In this lesson, we'll learn about the consequences of this meeting and its impact on generations of Africans. Let's dive in. Thousands of years before this meeting took place, Africans had established their own kingdoms and empires. These states were imperfect, just as governments are today. They were home to many different ethnic groups that often fought, and by the 1500s, many of these groups were engaged in an international slave trade that transported people, usually prisoners of war, from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. European merchants had set up trading posts along the African coast to procure human labor, enslaved labor, to farm cash crops like sugar and cotton on plantations in the Americas. Because most African nations would only trade prisoners of war into slavery, European nations stoked conflict between African nations to keep war and the slave trade going. By the 1800s, around 12 million African people had been forcibly moved all around the world through the transatlantic slave trade. And by 1850, Africa's total population was 50 million, half of what scholars estimate it would have been without the slave trade. Meanwhile, in Europe, an industrial revolution was taking place. Factories produced tons of goods which were sold around the world, but those factories needed raw materials, natural resources used to manufacture goods. Take a look at this map. What raw materials in Africa might be attractive to Europeans? Africa had abundant raw materials, including oil and copper, which Europe needed for manufacturing. It was also home to gold deposits, a commodity that could be sold. Realizing that Africa could provide raw materials to fuel their factories and labor to grow cash crops, European nations scrambled for ways to access both. One method, colonialism, the practice of taking control of a territory, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting its resources and peoples. European nations were in fierce competition for colonies, which provided captive markets, places where European nations could sell their manufactured goods exclusively. Ultimately, Europeans didn't just want access to African resources, they wanted control, and in 1884, they devised a way to get it. At the Berlin Conference, representatives from 14 states, including 12 from Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States, met to discuss Africa's natural resources. No African leaders or representatives were present. Representatives from Britain and France designated huge swaths of the continent for themselves, while others like Portugal, Belgium, and Spain made their own claims. The agreements made at the conference prevented conflict among participating nations while they systematically extracted resources from the African continent and built up their own empires. The word empire and the practice of building and expanding empires birthed the word imperialism, a method of extending a country's power and influence to other nations through political or military force. In Africa, Europeans practice imperialism in two ways: direct and indirect rule. Under direct rule, European countries established colonial governments made up entirely of Europeans on African land and sent settlers to steal and occupy those lands, displacing or enslaving African people in the process. In Angola, instead of using military force, Portuguese settlers married into royal families in an effort to legitimize their rule. Most instances of direct rule were much more violent. In South Africa and the Congo, European settlers stole land and waged war with devastating consequences. Though groups like the Khoikhoi and Xhosa fought valiantly, white settlers were successful in implementing colonial governments that disenfranchised African people, preventing them from fully participating in government or the economy. In the Congo, cruel punishments were enacted on anyone who refused to work for free. Direct rule gave Europeans the ability to extract labor and raw materials without the consent of African people. But more often than not, imperialism was indirect. Nations like Britain incorporated existing political structures, kingdoms, and chiefdoms into new colonial governments, making deals with African rulers to achieve their economic goals while avoiding bloody, expensive wars. How are the systems of imperialism similar? Both direct and indirect rule asserted foreign control over African people and resources. Though indirect rule allowed elites to maintain power, wealth, and status, the masses suffered. To justify their actions, Europeans developed ideas about cultural superiority, believing their European cultures, languages, arts, and religion were the best in the world. And saviorism, the idea that white Europeans could save Africans. Take a look at this political cartoon. In it, a European army faces off against an opposing African one. At the forefront, a white female warrior waves a banner. Look closely at the words in the cartoon. What does this cartoon suggest about Europeans' justifications for imperialism? Many Europeans believed that Africans were uncivilized and that it was their duty to civilize them by teaching them European languages and religions and erasing their existing cultural practices. This belief justified European imperialism. Some even felt that they were doing a good thing. Christian missionaries played a huge role in civilizing African people, moving to the continent in droves to build schools and churches. They encouraged Africans to cast aside their own traditions and adopt European ones. Despite resistance, by 1914, the majority of the African continent was under European rule. Which of the following were likely impacts of imperialism? Imperialism proved extremely beneficial for European nations. African resources like copper, oil, diamonds, and cash crops like palm oil, cocoa, and coffee became the fabric of European industry and wealth. Meanwhile, African resistance efforts were impeded by colonial boundaries drawn by European nations, which grouped various ethnic groups, many of whom had been at war or governed separately for centuries, together in the same countries. This kept African nations embroiled in conflict and prevented them from successfully revolting against imperial rule for decades. Slavery, low-wage labor, and the loss of land decimated African economies. Unfair trade agreements allowed European nations to flood African markets with cheap manufactured goods, making it harder for African merchants to sell their own goods. Despite the devastating economic and political impact, Africans continued to resist. During the Battle of Adwa in 1896, Ethiopian forces defeated an invading Italian army in one of many battles that would ultimately leave Ethiopia as the only African nation to never be colonized. Their victory at the turn of the 20th century foreshadowed what was to come: independence movements and wars across the continent as Africans fought to remove the chains of imperialism. Now it's time to show what you know. What were the causes of imperialism in Africa? What were the effects? European nations looking for cheap labor and access to raw materials descended on Africa with dreams of empire. Bolstered by their own sense of cultural superiority, many attempted to erase existing African political, economic, and cultural systems, replacing them with European ones. Africans resisted in various ways, but imperial rule continued for decades. Thanks for learning with us today and for taking another step toward putting together the pieces of the past.